Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Unexpected by Laylah Abrams. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. So, Cinderella or the Enchanted Princess? Claire squinted at the two thumbnail images on the screen, then scowled at her best friend. Wait, you were serious? You actually invited me to your parents' place to watch cartoons? Candy shrugged and gave Claire an innocent smile, one of the real ones, like back when they were kids. She hardly ever got to see one of those smiles anymore. Her heart turned a little gooey until Candy answered. Since Vince canceled, we can totally girl out. Maybe you can meet him at New Year's, though. Claire somehow didn't roll her eyes. Maybe. If Candy was still dating him then. 6 months was her record so far. What would you rather watch? Candy gave Claire a sidelong glance. Not some boring documentary. I was going to vote for Shaun of the Dead. Candy shuddered. No, that's much worse. Anyway, these aren't just cartoons, they're classics. I don't know how Cinderella ever became a classic. She has a horrible life until some rich guy decides to marry her. Why does it always have to be a rich guy? Now Candy was the one with her brows raised, trying not to roll her eyes. What exactly do you have against rich guys? She waved a hand encompassing the home theater in which they sat, with a 15-foot screen and seats for 30 tucked in a corner of the Harrington family mansion. Point taken, Claire answered. But they knew each other for a couple hours. How does that make sense? It's love at first sight. It's romantic and sweet. Not really, unless looks are the only thing that mattered. Candy cocked her head and nodded. Yep, Claire laughed. Hey, Insta-love is in the news all the time. In the tabloids, Claire said. And you know how real those are. Headlines about Claire loving and leaving a different man appeared on a monthly basis. Candy headlined at least weekly and retweeted the articles. Well, these are happy stories, Candy added under her breath. You could use some of that. Claire straightened in her velvet chair. Candy had noticed. Even from across the country? Claire's well-trained smile wavered, and she reached out to squeeze her friend's hand. I'm okay, Candy. Candy squeezed back. So you say, what you really need is a guy to sweep you off your feet. Claire withdrew her hand. Not gonna happen. She didn't get swept away. She preferred her space. Wasn't that what all the magazines said about her? The familiar emptiness growing over the last few months welled up. She breathed in. No, she was not lonely. She was fine. What's the other movie about? I've never heard of it. Candy clicked a button on her remote and read the description on the screen. A beautiful princess. You see, why is the being beautiful always the important part? Her mouth twitched. Why can't she just have a nice personality? She covered a laugh as Candy glared at her. Okay, keep reading. A beautiful princess is put under a sorcerer's spell. With ice in her heart, she is trapped alone in a tower forever. But can a peasant turn into a prince, break the spell, and rescue her? That's silly. How is a peasant supposed to turn himself into a prince? Well, at least he's not another rich guy. True, Claire nodded. And with the self-assurance to take all that on, very attractive and non-royalty, but why does the guy need to rescue her? Why doesn't the guy ever need rescuing? Why are we having this conversation? It's just a fairy tale. It's not supposed to be like the real world. That's the whole point. Claire did roll her eyes this time. Fairy tales. Ridiculous. Chapter 1. Nomad, the new fine dining restaurant at the top of the Harrington Hotel in Soho, which opened in the fall, offers a contemporary atmosphere and an extensive wine list. Still, most of its appeal comes from the notorious family who owns it. New York Tribune food section. The minimalist's clock over the bar glowered at Nick, a full 12 minutes before his shift. He was always on time. Still, he quickened his step as he weaved between tables draped in gleaming white linen and triangular wood and chrome chairs. He skirted the floor-to-ceiling windows on his left. Whoever installed the lighting understood the clientele. The diners couldn't see anything but their own reflections in the glass. If he drew too near, the windows would give him away. Glad you're here a little early, said a voice behind him. Too late. Nick stopped short and closed his eyes. Not today. Not after the day he'd had. I was hoping to talk to you about a little scheduling difficulty, continued his manager. Possibly taking on a shift. Nick's shoulders tensed as he pivoted back. School, work, sleep. Repeat. Like one of the cog people in Metropolis carrying out his duties. Except he wanted to do this. Supposedly. Sure, he answered, his voice as cheery as a game show host's. I'm happy to help if I can. Greg's jowls lifted as he smiled. That's the right attitude. Of course it was. It's what got him hired in the fall with 0 serving experience. I need someone to cover Carol's shift tomorrow, said Greg. Breakfast and lunch. Nick's backpack grew heavier, weighed down by the letter stuffed in the front pocket. All day it continued to gain mass and expand like a black hole. He could live without sleep. As an undergrad, the job of a thumbtack in his pocket kept him awake in class after late nights in a restaurant kitchen, but he couldn't miss school. I'm sorry, I have a couple classes I can't skip. His boss nodded. Yeah, that's why we don't usually hire students. He pressed his lips into a thin line. You know, if you want to keep working here, we're going to need some flexibility on hours. Greg clomped into the kitchen as the hollowness seeped into Nick's chest. If he lost this job, he couldn't afford to stay in the city anyway. What if you're throwing your life away following this dream? More than 3 years later, his almost fiance's doubts persisted in his own head. He changed into the white shirt and black pants of his uniform in the staff restroom and walked back to the dining area. The sickly beat of light electronica dripped out of the speakers. A businessman argued with his wireless headset as he sat alone. Nick tugged at the cuff of his sleeve. Another night of being looked through like an automaton in the background. Another day on his dreary treadmill, which perhaps he should admit wasn't taking him anywhere. Diane, the bartender, sidled up and nudged him with her elbow. You'd better put on one of those dreamy smiles, Holden, she said in her southern drawl. I want some big tips tonight. A smile tickled Nick's face. Diane floated through life like a shiny mylar balloon, not letting anything get her down. You're looking a little low tonight, she said. Bad day? She would listen if he needed to vent, but he had planned every move to get to where he wanted to be, from the classes he selected as an undergrad to the skills he mastered to appeal to grad schools. He should have his life under control. Not really, just tired. That's right, she laughed. You don't have bad days. Can't fit them into your schedule like fun or relaxation. Hey, any chance you might finally be able to come over for dinner next week? The little monsters want to thank you for the birthday presents, and Mike would like to meet my bodyguard. A man at the bar leered in Diane's direction. Speaking of which, Nick said, voice lowered, watch out for your 8 o'clock. She peeped behind them and sighed. Why doesn't this mean anything to these people? She asked, pointing to her wedding ring. She let the band glint in the light, and her face glowed as it always did when she brought up her husband and kids. She believed in happily ever afters. Nick, too, had been raised on them. Your grandfather flew here first with only $50 in his pocket, his mother used to tell him, her words rising and falling with a slight French accent despite leaving Tunisia as a girl. She met Nick's dad after high school when he was an apprentice electrician repairing old wiring in her family's house. And that was it. Nick's parents still looked at each other with the same glow Diane had for her family, and they raved about their only child to anyone who would listen. If he starts getting personal, I'll ask you to help me get stuff from the storage room, Nick offered. Now don't change the subject. Dinner next week? He took a deep breath and smelled the piney tang of paint and turpentine from all the years spent building up his portfolio to earn a scholarship to grad school. Details of his current paintings cycled through his head. He could modify his blending and gradation, maybe make a few changes in his use of light and tone, if he just kept working. The letter from the dean didn't matter. He would handle it. I'd love to, but I'm on shift all week except Wednesday, and I need to spend more time in the studio. Okay, I'll let you off the hook this time. Diane poked him once more. But one of these days, I'm going to have to instruct you on work-life balance. She returned to the bar, and Nick scanned the dining area again. Only a few small tables. It wouldn't be so bad. The hours passed quickly once he stopped worrying about school. But as he carried creme brulee out to a table 20 minutes before close, the hostess gasped behind him. Oh my gosh, but please follow me, she said. He turned, but only the group's backs faced him as the hostess led them away from the other guests toward one of the tables by the windows. On his return trip to the kitchen, Greg brushed past him to greet the group of 6. His boss met his eyes and lifted his brows, a silent directive to keep him happy. Nick let the 3 couples flip through the menus for a few minutes, then walked over. "Good evening," he said. "Oh." He held his friendly smile and didn't even blink at the same platinum blonde who adorned half the celebrity magazines Diane kept under the bar. A leaked sex tape meant 3/4 of the world could identify Candy Harrington even in night vision. She checked her stage-thick makeup in her Holden compact. Pink rhinestones, the same shade as her glittery top, sparkled on her nails. Hopefully they were only rhinestones. "Welcome to Nomad," Nick continued, then paused again. Sitting next to Candy in a dark blue dress with a natural radiance brighter than Jules was Claire Morgan. "I'll be taking care of you tonight." The former model stood out like a lily pond on a city block, blooming between billboards and taxicabs. As he recited his usual speech about the specials, Claire, leaning over the menu, swept a lock of her chestnut hair away from the fluid curl of her fingers, like one of Degas' dancers. "So, please let me know if you have any questions," he told the group. "About the menu, I mean. Or, about texture and 19th century French landscapes. I could probably handle that too." Claire looked up, luminous blue eyes resting on him as her lips widened in a smile. He wasn't sure if he introduced himself. He might have forgotten his name. "I feel like risotto. You can get that, right?" the 3rd woman in the group asked, or rather commanded, without even picking up a menu. Nick turned toward her and tried to concentrate on something besides Claire Morgan's eyes, like how there was no ideal time to ask cooks to make something not on the menu, but 11 o'clock at night wasn't even close. "Absolutely, I'll see what we can do. And does everyone else?" "We have to go shopping tomorrow," Candy said to her friend. It wasn't like Nick was standing there trying to get the rest of their orders or anything. "Even if it's still colder than the Arctic, the only fun thing about coming to this miserable city is I can usually find a super cute pair of shoes." She reddened and glanced at her date. "And seeing you, of course, Vince." Vince shrugged. "If only you'd moved to LA with me," she said, pushing her bottom lip forward. "The thing is, Wall Street's in New York." "If you'd like, I can come back," began Nick. "Well, I'm with you, Candy," said her risotto-loving friend. "Liam and I would never choose to leave LA for New York this time of year, but I have to be at that gala tomorrow. Sometimes I wish I wasn't an 8th-generation Prescott. Wouldn't have to go to these boring things if I came from nobodies like you." Candy winced. Nick's fingers tensed at his side. When he was in college, classmates at Yale had whispered, "His mom's a public school art teacher and his dad's just an electrician," as though hard work was embarrassing. Claire's eyes flashed from Candy to narrow at their other friend. She leaned back in her chair, admiring her nails. "It's just as well," she said. "Could you imagine me and Candy in that crowd? Honestly, Zoe, what's the point of a party with no red carpet to pose on?" Zoe's face pinched. Was that a clap back against Risotto Girl? "You definitely do a great job of looking sexy," said Claire's date. It must have taken the man hours to get his slicked back hair just so and to pick out the exact hue of skinny pants to complement his burgundy leather shoes. "Why, thank you, Ethan." Claire smiled, her eyelashes fluttering. She actually batted her eyes at him. Nick quashed the urge to gag. "I can come back if you need a few more minutes," he said. "No, wait, we know what we want," said Candy. They did not. While each of them decided what they would eat and drink, the others interrupted with the best nightclubs in New York and gossip about someone's new summer home. Really the opposite of the things taking up his headspace. When Nick was an undergrad, he could have majored in engineering or computer science like his dad wanted. He would still hate his job now, but at least he wouldn't stress about having one. "Ooh, ask the waiter," said Zoe, and smacked her lips shut as she smothered a laugh. Her date, Liam, snorted. "All right, then. We'll let him settle this." He turned to Nick. "Tell me something, waiter." Other conversations broke off, all eyes at the table fixed on Nick. "See, my parents gave me a yacht for my birthday, which is a better name. Or less dumb, which is a less dumb name," interrupted Zoe. "Which is better?" continued Liam. "Loaded?" He paused. For the win, his chest puffed. Or, I make ship happen. Several replies coursed through Nick's head, none of which would help him keep his job. I'm not sure I have an opinion. See, said Zoe, he thinks they're dumb too, especially the last one. It's something my dad would use. Whatever, said Liam. He looked at Nick again and sneered. Though, you don't need to worry about that stuff like that, do you? Maybe if you become like VP of serving, he guffawed. Nick's jaw tightened. To them, he wasn't a real person with intelligence or drive or dreams he strove toward. No, I don't need to worry about naming yachts, he said, meeting Liam's eyes. Usually just about grown-up important things, but if I ever want one, I won't have my parents buy it for me. Liam dropped his eyes and cleared his throat. Claire smiled at Nick again. And I'd name it Zombie Apocalypse, he added. This time she laughed, a soft, intoxicating jingle. Her cheeks creased as she smothered it like ripples playing on a stream. Oh my God, Candy said. The wings! I'm totally getting the wings! Nick took their orders. They didn't get much food, but he dashed back and forth, carrying drinks for them, usually in response to snapped fingers and a, hey, you! Still, he held his head high, refrained from dumping overpriced bottled water on anyone, and tried not to stare at Claire. As he loaded another round of drinks onto his tray at the bar, Diane pecked at her phone. Gotta let Mike know I have to be here to close up, she said. Did Greg leave for the night? Nick asked. Yeah. Before he left, he said to make sure Candy and her friends feel welcome, even if it gets a little late. So he gets to leave at closing time, but we don't. Yep, she replied, though seeing them in person is almost worth it. Nick weighed the sound of Claire's lap against the snapped fingers of her date. Maybe. Nick still had reading to do for his morning class, and the comfort of his bed at some point would be nice. They'd have to say something if it got late enough, right? Or did Greg expect them to be there all night? Back with their order, Nick lifted each glass off the tray. Candy's drink was always pink. Claire's was always simple. Her eyes were on him. Again. When he leaned to place her drink on the table, his sleeve brushed her shoulder. The wisp of her scent floated up, floral and exotic. She peeked at him with something not quite a smile. Thank you, she said softly, her cheeks touched with pink. Warmth spread from his chest to his fingertips. You're welcome. She couldn't possibly. Could she? Of course not. She was Claire Morgan, and he was a waiter in her friend's restaurant. I won't be in New York then, but I'm sure Claire would love to go, said Candy. At the sound of her name, Claire looked toward her friend. I know you two met on New Year's, she continued, talking to Claire's date, Ethan. Vince says you're doing stuff on Wall Street. And she turned to Claire. You're into your family's business. You two probably have lots in common. Candy, Claire said with a hint of warning. Well, maybe you won't be so mopey all the time if Candy. Tales of cold-hearted Claire discarding men were common at the supermarket checkout. If Candy tried to set her up, why would she need to? And mopey? Not from what he could see. The next time Nick came around at the table, Ethan was talking. I manage the investments in the fund. It's like putting your money in a bank, but I use the money to buy and sell securities, stocks and stuff. You end up with a lot more money than you put in. Claire nodded and scanned her phone. So this new investment opportunity could be very interesting to someone like your father, he said. Do you think you could mention it to him? I mean, no need to try to explain the whole thing to him, but maybe you could give him my card. Of course, she answered. And why would I try to discuss this with him? I only interned in investment technology for one summer. I barely learned how to program pre-trade analytics. Ethan's brows furrowed. My father made his fortune writing code and designing circuits in his garage, building things, she said. He values tangible investments. Her date blinked as though she were a talking giraffe. Not that I know anything about this hedge fund stuff. She tilted her head and added a ditzy giggle. Is it kind of like gambling at a casino? Nick swallowed a laugh. She just called Ethan an idiot to his face, though the man continued to ogle her. Her eyes darted up, catching Nick's amusement. The edge of her mouth curled again in that almost smile. When Ethan turned to talk to Candy's boyfriend, Nick leaned over. So, pre-trade analytics, huh? That's pretty nerdy. Claire's lips parted in surprise. All right, Mr. 19th century French landscapes. The back of his eyes ached with fatigue, and the reading for his morning class awaited, but yeah, that was worth it. Claire didn't seem to want to be here any more than he did. She checked her phone under the table whenever the others erupted in amused howls over one of their stories. Every so often, she forced her laugh or her smile slipped. She even stopped drinking and only pretended to sip. Nick gave her a questioning look as he reached for her untouched cocktail glass. She hunched a little and made a small shake of her head as though she didn't want him to draw attention to it. Not that the other people at the table would notice anything outside themselves. The new busboy orbited nearby, his head drooping as though he would fall over. Diane rubbed bleary eyes behind the bar. The needle-like hands of the clock over the bar slid past 1 o'clock. The staff and possibly Claire were held prisoner. Someone should set them free. Nick could politely announce last call, nothing for Greg to get upset about, nothing that could endanger his job. He stepped toward the table and opened his mouth. They all got up before he said anything. Just charge it to the penthouse, Candy said. She turned to Claire. Zoe and Liam have my guest room. You can come hang out with us, or maybe if you and Ethan want to go somewhere. Would she? Nick took in Claire's pretty face one final time before he hurried to tell Diane the news. They're packing up. Diane yawned and rubbed her eyes again. Great. I'll start closing up. Hopefully I won't fall asleep on the train. She lived all the way in Queens while he lived within walking distance. She yawned again. He could let Diane possibly miss her stop on the way home, or he could lose a few more minutes of sleep. Why don't you walk to the subway with the kitchen crew? I'll close up, he said. She shook her head, thick blonde curls falling into her eyes. I should stay and help. No, it's okay. The guests are already halfway out the door. There's not much to do besides lock up. All right, if you're sure. After everyone else left, Nick turned out the lights and back and picked up his coat and bag. He rubbed an ache out of his shoulders. Not the best ending to a bad day, but interesting at least. He'd be home in 15 minutes. He could read the papers for class for a half hour, and he'd still get a good 4 or 5 hours of sleep. He stopped at the edge of the dining area. Everyone hadn't left. Claire stood in the empty room. Did she stay behind on purpose, maybe to talk to him? His pulse quickened. She had a hand under her elbow. The other held a phone to her ear. Right, the phone call she was expecting. He waited, trying not to listen. It had to be a family emergency at this hour. Probably the reason she didn't have fun with her friends. Did you at least try my algorithm? Well, it would help you profile potential distributors, and then you wouldn't need to delay the perfume's launch. Yes, actually, I do have some experience. She switched to another language, possibly Japanese, as her words became clipped. On top of everything else, she spoke Japanese. But this wasn't a family emergency. It was some business-related fire, a complex, time-consuming fire. Did she realize people had to close up, that they might be waiting to go home? Nick glanced at the clock above the bar again. He didn't want to stand around eavesdropping. Excuse me, I'm very sorry, but would you mind continuing your call outside? He held up his keys. I really need to close up the restaurant. I'll be done in a minute, she said sharply, waving her hand at him as though he were a mosquito or a fly, and turned away. Her handbag, worth more than his car back in Connecticut, swayed on her arm. Of course, he was lowly, insignificant, not worth her time. She hadn't seen him as someone, after all. He was below them, these people who never worried about paychecks or rent, or about hopes and dreams that may never lead to anything despite sweat and sleepless nights. Sneers, jokes, snapped fingers, a dismissive flutter of a hand at a servant who was no longer entertaining. He squeezed the keys in his palm. Listen, miss, he said, his voice low and taut. I don't particularly care how famous you are or how much money you have. I've been waiting hours for you and your friends to realize the restaurant is closed, and I'm done waiting. She stared, her face flushing. Her mouth fell open, but she said nothing. Then she spun and stumped out to the hall.